What if the most powerful meeting in African history happened without a single African in the room? The truth about what Europe actually decided, and what they didn't, will change how you see the world's map forever. Let's find out.
What is the actual truth about the Berlin Conference of 1884? For over a century, history books have painted a very specific picture of this fateful summit. Top-hatted European aristocrats standing over a map, casually carving up the African continent with a ruler and a red pen.
But that iconic image of diplomats slicing through mountains and rivers is a complete myth. Half of Africa's international borders did not even exist until 7 years after the conference ended. The reality of what happened inside the Reichskanzler Palais over those 104 winter days is far more insidious. They weren't there to draw lines on a map. They were there to prevent a massive, impending European war.
If the European powers weren't initially interested in carving up the entire continent, what specific crisis forced them to the negotiating table in Berlin? What was the flashpoint that threatened to shatter the fragile peace of 19th century Europe?
The catalyst was a bitter dispute over a single, highly lucrative waterway, the Congo River. In February 1884, a controversial Anglo-Portuguese treaty attempted to hand Portugal exclusive control over the river's mouth. This immediately threatened the vital trade networks of France and Germany, pushing the rival empires to the absolute brink of military conflict over access to Africa's vast, resource-rich interior.
While massive empires like Britain and France flexed their naval muscles over the Congo, who was the unlikely mastermind quietly pulling the strings in the shadows, turning a regional trade dispute into an opportunity for unimaginable personal wealth?
It was King Leopold II of Belgium. Unlike other monarchs expanding their national empires, Leopold wanted the Congo for himself, as his own private personal property. To avoid alarming the heavyweights, he launched a brilliant deceptive public relations campaign. He convinced the world he merely wanted to establish a philanthropic charity to bring free trade, science, and civilization to the region.
With the greatest diplomatic minds of Europe assembling in Berlin to settle the Congo question, how did the king of a minor European nation manage to hijack the agenda and outmaneuver the most powerful empires on Earth?
Leopold executed a spectacular act of diplomatic espionage. He smuggled his top agent, the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley, into the summit. Stanley was officially credentialed as a technical advisor for the United States delegation, but in reality, he was acting as Leopold's covert proxy. From inside the room, Stanley manipulated the negotiations, ensuring the resulting treaties heavily favored Leopold's secret ambitions.
Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, orchestrated this massive gathering. Given his reputation for aggressive expansion, why was he suddenly playing peacemaker? And what was his grand vision for a German Africa?
Surprisingly, Bismarck absolutely despised colonial politics. He famously declared, "My map of Africa lies in Europe." He didn't host the Berlin Conference to claim African territory. He hosted it to pit Britain and France against each other, securing Germany's dominance on the European continent. For Bismarck, Africa was merely a giant chessboard used to distract and divide his heavily armed neighbors.
14 major powers spent 104 days debating the future of a landmass 3 times the size of Europe. Out of the millions of people whose homelands were being discussed, how many African leaders were invited to the table?
Exactly 0. Not a single African king, diplomat, or scholar was invited, consulted, or even informed. The only African presence in the opulent Reichskanzler Palais was a giant 2-dimensional piece of paper hanging on the wall. The diplomats simply stared at this massive abstraction, entirely blind to the complex, thriving civilizations that actually existed on the ground.
If these diplomats didn't actually draw the borders of Africa during those winter months, and they were completely disconnected from the reality of the continent, what exactly did they achieve that changed the course of history forever?
The most surprising fact about the 1884 Berlin Conference is that the 14 European powers gathered there didn't actually draw the borders of Africa. They simply designed the legal rulebook for stealing it. Triggered by a near war over the Congo River, the summit established the principle of effective occupation, firing the starting gun for a violent, decades-long scramble for Africa. Without a single African voice in the room, diplomats dismantled centuries of indigenous statecraft, ultimately trapping over 3,000 distinct ethnic groups within arbitrary, artificial borders that continue to drive conflict today.
We've all seen the famous imagery: European diplomats standing over a giant map, casually slicing up a continent with a ruler. But what if that defining historical moment is a myth? What is the truth about the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885?
The reality is far more cynical. The diplomats who gathered in Berlin didn't come to draw borders. They came because they were on the brink of an all-out European war. And the spark that almost ignited this global conflict wasn't a vast territory, but a single strategic waterway, the Congo River.
By the late 19th century, the coastal regions of Africa were already heavily exploited, but the vast interior remained largely untouched by European empires. Why were the most powerful empires in the world ready to go to war over a single river?
The Congo River was the ultimate commercial highway into the heart of the continent. When Britain and Portugal signed a secret treaty in February 1884 to lock down the mouth of the Congo, it threatened to block rival empires from accessing the lucrative interior. Panic swept through European capitals, threatening to shatter decades of fragile peace.
The tension was reaching a boiling point. The British and Portuguese alliance infuriated the French, who had their own ambitions in the region. How did German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck react to this escalating crisis?
Surprisingly, Bismarck despised colonial politics. He famously declared, "My map of Africa lies in Europe." Yet he recognized a golden opportunity. By stepping in to host a diplomatic summit in Berlin, Bismarck could play the rival powers against each other, securing Germany's dominance on the continent without firing a single shot. He sent out the invitations, but he wasn't the one truly controlling the board.
While Bismarck managed the grand theater of European diplomacy, a much darker agenda was unfolding in the shadows of the Reichskanzlerpalais. Who was secretly pulling the strings behind the scenes of Bismarck's diplomatic summit?
It was King Leopold II of Belgium. Operating purely for his own greed, Leopold wanted the Congo for himself. To outmaneuver the superpowers, he smuggled the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley into the conference. Disguised as a mere technical advisor for the United States delegation, Stanley manipulated the negotiations to serve Leopold's grand, horrifying vision.
Leopold wasn't representing the Belgian government. He was acting as a private citizen. To convince 14 rival nations to hand him the keys to the Congo, he needed a spectacular lie. What did King Leopold promise the world in exchange for this massive territory?
He promised a utopia. Leopold swore he would run the Congo as a massive philanthropic charity, bringing free trade and humanitarian aid to the region. The diplomats bought it. On May 29, 1885, a territory 76 times the size of his own country was handed over as the private, personal property of exactly one man.
The promise of charity was a smokescreen for one of the most brutal extraction regimes in human history. With his private army, the Force Publique, enforcing wild rubber quotas, how extreme was the violence inflicted on the Congo under Leopold's private ownership? The atrocities were so unprecedented that George Washington Williams literally invented the phrase crimes against humanity in 1890 to describe them. Villages were burned, and soldiers systematically severed the hands of Congolese people who failed to meet quotas. Historians estimate that 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's reign of terror.
Leopold's nightmare in the Congo was just the beginning. The agreements made in Berlin didn't just hand over a river basin, they established a lethal precedent. How did a summit about a single river ultimately doom the entire African continent?
The most surprising fact about the 1884 Berlin Conference is that the 14 European powers gathered there didn't actually draw the borders of Africa. They simply designed the legal rulebook for stealing it. Triggered by a near war over the Congo River, the summit established the principle of effective occupation, firing the starting gun for a violent, decades-long scramble for Africa. Without a single African voice in the room, diplomats dismantled centuries of indigenous statecraft,
ultimately trapping over 3,000 distinct ethnic groups within arbitrary artificial borders that continue to drive conflict today.
The infamous image of men with rulers slicing up a map is a historical illusion. The conference only created the justification for conquest. If the diplomats in Berlin didn't draw the final borders, when did the actual map of modern Africa take shape?
The true carving of Africa happened in the blood and mud of the decades that followed. Half of Africa's international borders didn't even exist until 1891, 7 years after the conference closed. The rulebook had been written, the starting gun fired, and the violent reality of effective occupation was about to consume a continent.
We are told it was a diplomatic triumph, a peaceful resolution to European rivalries. But behind the closed doors of the Reichskanzler Palais, the reality was far more sinister. What is the ultimate truth of this infamous gathering?
It wasn't merely a cartography exercise. It was the creation of a legal framework for continental theft, and no one exploited this new rulebook more ruthlessly than a single monarch who used the conference to orchestrate the greatest land heist in human history.
While massive empires like Britain and France vied for dominance, the grand prize of the conference, the vast, resource-rich Congo Basin, was handed not to a nation, but to a single man. How did he pull off this incredible deception?
Leopold sold the diplomats a magnificent lie. He promised to run the Congo as a philanthropic enterprise, a massive free trade zone dedicated to humanitarian charity. He even smuggled in his top agent, explorer Henry Morton Stanley, disguised as an American technical advisor, to manipulate the negotiations. The result? The creation of the Congo Free State, Leopold's private personal property.
With the international community's blessing and no oversight, Leopold dropped the philanthropic mask. The supposed charity was rapidly transformed into a brutal corporate extraction machine. What were the consequences of this absolute power?
The results were apocalyptic. To enforce wild rubber quotas, Leopold deployed a private army, the Force Publique. They terrorized villages, systematically severing the hands of Congolese people who failed to meet their impossible targets. Between 1885 and 1908, an estimated 10 million Congolese died from murder, starvation, and disease in a relentless pursuit of profit.
The sheer scale of the atrocities in the Congo could not remain hidden forever. When eyewitnesses finally began to report the nightmare unfolding in Leopold's private fiefdom, it forced the world to confront a new kind of evil.
The horrors defied existing language. In 1890, after witnessing the devastation firsthand, African-American historian and diplomat George Washington Williams wrote an open letter to Leopold. To describe the systemic, industrial-scale slaughter he saw, Williams literally invented a new legal and moral phrase: crimes against humanity.
Leopold's terror was unique in its privatization, but the Berlin Conference unleashed a wider continental catastrophe. The diplomats had agreed on a specific legal mechanism that made passive claims invalid. How did this rule ignite a continent-wide inferno?
They established the principle of effective occupation. A European power couldn't just claim land on paper. They had to physically occupy it, plant a flag, and establish administration. This deadly rule fired the starting gun for the scramble for Africa, sending heavily armed European militaries marching inland to violently conquer territories just to prove they owned them.
As rules were drafted that would dictate the lives, lands, and futures of an entire continent, one might assume the inhabitants of that continent had some voice in the proceedings. Who represented Africa in Berlin?
Absolutely no one. Throughout the grueling 104-day conference, 0 African representatives, kings, or diplomats were invited or consulted. The only African presence in the opulent room where the continent was divided was a giant piece of paper, a massive wall map that reduced complex, ancient civilizations to a two-dimensional abstraction waiting to be carved up.
We often imagine diplomats with rulers, drawing arbitrary lines across a map in a single dramatic afternoon. But the reality of what Bismarck, Leopold, and the European powers accomplished
is far more devastating.
The most surprising fact about the 1884 Berlin Conference is that the 14 European powers gathered there didn't actually draw the borders of Africa. They simply designed the legal rulebook for stealing it. Triggered by a near war over the Congo River, the summit established the principle of effective occupation, firing the starting gun for a violent, decades-long scramble for Africa. Without a single African voice in the room, diplomats dismantled centuries of indigenous statecraft, ultimately trapping over 3,000 distinct ethnic groups within arbitrary, artificial borders that continue to drive conflict today.
The empires that designed the rulebook have long since packed up their flags and gone home. Yet the architecture of extraction and division they built in Berlin remains deeply embedded in the soil.
Today, Africa is a continent of 54 sovereign nations, but they are still forced to navigate the geopolitical traps set in 1884. The artificial borders severed trade routes, split families, and forced rival groups into shared states. The Berlin Conference didn't just steal Africa's land, it attempted to steal its future, a future the continent is still fiercely reclaiming.
We started by asking, the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, and the answer? The most surprising fact about the 1884 Berlin Conference is that the 14 European powers gathered there didn't actually draw the borders of Africa. They simply designed the legal rulebook for stealing it. Triggered by a near war over the Congo River, the summit established the principle of effective occupation, firing the starting gun for a violent, decades-long scramble for Africa. If this changed how you see things, share it with someone who needs to hear it.